Good afternoon, brethren. My name is Christopher Powell, and I am talking to you today to provide an introduction to a paper that I'm going to deliver in Quattro Coronati Lodge on the 20th of February 2025. I'm a past master of the lodge, and the paper that I'm delivering concerns the early history of the Royal Arch in England, from its creation up to the time of the warranting of the first lodges in 1769. It is the fourth of a series of 4 papers that I have written and published, which deal with the new Masonic degrees that were created between 1720 and 1745. They are the 3rd degree, the Royal Arch that I am obviously talking about today, the degree of Knight Templar, and the degree that eventually was called the Royal Order of Scotland, but in the 18th century, in the early 18th century, was called the degree of Herodom of Kilwinning. Now, those particular papers have appeared in different journals. The 3rd degree paper is in AQC 2021. The Royal Arch paper, of course, will be published online in January and then in the journal in the normal way in November. The Royal Order of Scotland paper appears in the Transactions of the Manchester Association for Masonic Research, and that was published in 2019. And the Knight Templar paper appears in the annual transactions of the Bristol Masonic Society, called Corona Gladiorum, and that is published in October 2024. If you have difficulty in sourcing any of those papers, I suggest you look online, because you will find that the Bristol Masonic Society and the Manchester Association both have websites with details of their transactions and how to obtain them. And of course, 2 members of the lodge are particularly involved with those 2 societies. Roger Pemberton with the Manchester Association as a former president, and Tony Baker as the editor of the Bristol Transactions. If one is talking about Masonic degrees, one needs to define one's terms. It's very, very important. And the only way you can define a degree is by some unique feature that is in that degree and in no other degree. Because you will find that there are degrees that have the same ritual but different names, and degrees that have the same names but different rituals. To give you an example, if we're looking at the 3rd degree, the Master Mason degree, the unique feature of that degree is the Hiramic legend. Now you might think, well, what about the 5 points of fellowship? It's a very colourful part of the ceremony. But the clue to the problem is in the title, 5 points of fellowship, because that particular part of the ceremony was originally in the Fellowcraft degree. So you can't define the 3rd degree by the 5 points of fellowship, because that part of the ceremony was in 2 degrees. But the Hiramic legend is only in the 3rd degree, the Master Mason degree. Now, similarly with the Royal Arch, the unique feature is its legend. It's a 4th century legend dating back to Philostorgius, 4th century AD, and it concerns the discovery in a cave or a crypt under the ruins of King Solomon's Temple, a discovery made by labourers, sojourners, who discover a pillar, and on the pillar in the original story was a copy of the Gospel of St. John. In the Masonic ritual, it is the lost word. And those of you who know a bit about your 18th century history will realise that there is a very close connection between the opening of St. John's Gospel and the Mason word, which is found. Now, that particular story was first translated into English by Samuel Lee in 1659 in a book that he published called Orbis Miraculum, or Solomon's Temple Portrayed in Scripture Light. And we know that the third Grand Master, John Desaguliers, Dr. Desaguliers, owned a copy of that book because, in fact, funny enough, his copy with his signature in it was sold on eBay about 10 years ago. And Desaguliers obviously found this marvellous story that he could easily see would make a very nice Masonic ritual, but he could only use it, the story of the recovery of the word, if he had, there was a degree that accounted for the loss of the word. And of course that's exactly what the Hiramic legend is, that I would argue he created in the early 1720s. The original name for the degree containing that particular story was Scots Master, and it was worked in London and the provinces, in Bath and Bristol and Salisbury, for example, in the 1730s and 40s. It is the story that we know very well now, and those of you that are Royal Archmasons and have been at some stage in your life the principal sojourner will actually know that story by heart. And you'll be quite surprised when you read the original story, and I include that obviously in my paper, just how similar it is and how close it is to what we do today, 300 years later. The one thing we know about that degree, apart from the story, is that it was worked in what I'll call a craft lodge, a Scots Master's lodge, with a master and 2 wardens. Not as the Royal Arch now is worked in a chapter with 3 co-equal principals and 2 scribes. This is why we've got to be careful with defining our terms. But we also know from the minutes of those early Scots Master lodges that every candidate for the degree was already a Master Mason. Well, of course that makes sense, because after all, you can hardly understand the recovery of the word until you've actually worked or been told how it was lost. And that's in the Hiramic legend in the 3rd degree, the Master Mason degree. And this is where some problems start to occur. Because Dr. Designy in Ireland in 1743 didn't define his terms carefully and misunderstood the word master. And he took the word master to mean master of a lodge and not Master Mason. And so he declared, and the Irish declared, and subsequently the ancients declared, that in order to be a Royal Archmason, you had to have been the master of a lodge. Now that created enormous problems, because obviously there weren't many candidates. So then the ancients created a new degree called passing the chair, which meant that a Mason who'd not been a master of a lodge could sort of be put in the chair for a couple of minutes, given the secrets of the chair, come out of it again, and then, of course, qualify to be exalted in the Royal Arch. But originally, the requirement was to be a Master Mason, and the requirement nowadays is to be a Master Mason. That is the original, and that is today. Perfectly correct. The other problem with the Irish, and the other mistake they made in the 1740s, is they regarded it as a 4th degree. It was never intended as a 4th degree. It wasn't a 4th degree to start with, and it isn't a 4th degree now. It's the 2nd part of the 3rd degree. If you go to the Blue Book, the Book of Constitutions, you only have to look at page 1. And you will see that it says quite clearly there that Pure ancient Freemasonry consists of 3 degrees and no more. And it says 3rd degree, or the Master Mason, which includes the Supreme Order of the Holy Royal Arch. That's how it was created, and that, brethren, is how it is still. If we look at, say, Bristol, that worked the Scots Master degree in the late 1730s, and was working the Royal Arch in the late 1750s, 1758 to be precise, it was exactly the same degree. It was worked with a craft lodge layout of a master and 2 wardens. It's in the minutes, it's perfectly clear. But it has a different name. This is why we need our definitions, because the name had changed from Scots Master to Royal Arch. And that occurred in the 1740s, and it occurred probably for the most obvious reason of all, namely the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, and it was, if you like, politic to remove titles with Scots or Scotsmen in them, Scotland in them. And the name changed, but the degree did not change. Again, why it's so important to be defining our terms. Because the degree that was worked in Bristol in 1738 is just the same degree as worked in Bristol in 1758. But then a change occurred in the 1760s that was a major change and a structural change. It was more to do with the layout of the lodge, or chapter room as we call it, than to do with the ritual. The moderns decided in 1765 to set up a separate body to rule over Royal Arch. We call it today Supreme Grand Chapter. In those days it was actually called the Excellent Grand and Royal Chapter. Meetings were held in 1765 and a Charter of Compact was sealed in 1766, which created, as I say, what we call Supreme Grand Chapter. And then in 1769, Supreme Grand Chapter started warranting the first 8 chapters. We're ever so lucky that the minutes of the meetings that led to the formation, the signing of the Charter of Compact in 1766, setting up Supreme Grand Chapter, that those minutes are extant and they are detailed. And we're also lucky because Brother Dashwood in 1949 in AQC number 62 wrote a marvellous paper giving the contents of those minutes in detail. If we look at those minutes, it is very clear that by 1765 in London, the Royal Arch was very much as it is today, with 3 co-equal principals and 2 scribes, Zerubbabel, Haggai, Joshua, Scribe Ezra and Scribe Nehemiah, sitting in that arch shape, the 3 principals representing the 3 keystones, as in the story, and the 2 scribes, the pillars on either side. And in fact, incidentally, brethren, they were originally called pillars before they were called scribes. But that was a new development in 1765, and my guess is it came from Ireland, but I can't prove that. Those minutes describe the regalia of the Royal Arch for the moderns, not the ancients, for the moderns. And sometimes, if I'm giving a talk in a Royal Arch chapter and I'm talking about the Royal Arch in the 18th century, sometimes I actually wear 18th century Royal Arch regalia. And brethren, I can tell you, nobody notices, because the differences are so slight between 1765 and 2025. It's amazing. The only slight differences are that the The apron does not have the 2 tassels on it, which were added in 1841. And the triple taw isn't there. It's the original and correct letter T over letter H for Templum Hierosolyma, the temple at Jerusalem. In every other sense, in terms of colours and shapes and so on, everything is very much the same as we have nowadays. And of course that's very different from the craft, because the craft aprons that one wears and the apron I should be wearing in lodge actually dates from 1841. The Royal Arch apron that I wear dates from 1765. Much, much older, 80 years older, more or less. The ancients, of course, did not have a grand chapter, and the ancients worked the Royal Arch in their craft lodges up to about 1820, 1817. Their aprons, of course, were not standardised as the Royal Arch aprons were for the moderns. The ancients simply added a colour to the outside of their apron. They had blue for the craft, they had red for the Royal Arch, and if they went into KT, they put an extra black band around the side for KT. And then they added symbols appropriate to those orders, to the symbols that they'd already got on the apron for the craft and the Royal Arch and so on. There's a marvellous example of that actually in Warrington Museum, if you really want to see it. A super example. And I shall be illustrating that obviously in the published version of the paper. We're very lucky also, brethren, that we have the original ritual of the Royal Arch, the ritual that those Royal Arch masons of 1765 would have known. It's in the Sheffield manuscript number 1. And if you want to read it, I transcribed it and wrote a commentary on it, and it's published in AQC 126 in 2013. The jewel is the same too. It's illustrated, I think, 6 times on the Charter of Compact. And the earliest one is 1766, Dr. Ruby's jewel that you can see in the Grand Lodge Museum. Again, if you want to know about that, I wrote a paper on that, my first paper actually for AQC in 2010, AQC 123. It was the paper that I won the Norman B. Spencer Prize for. And that will give you, a full description of the jewel, which is, of course, the most important and most interesting jewel in the whole of Freemasonry. Something else we discover from those minutes is that there was a very important man involved in all these changes, and his name was John Maclean. He was the first principal of the Grand Chapter. And when he was succeeded in that office by Lord Blaney, who had just come out of the chair of Grand Lodge, Lord Blaney presented him with a medal, and the medal was the medal to state that he was the father and promoter of the Royal Arch. He'd clearly been a key player in all of this. And he was obviously very proud of this jewel, and also whenever he signed his signature after 1766, John Maclean usually put F and P after it for father and promoter. Sadly, we don't know really anything much about him. We know where he lived in London. We know that he was a marvellous cabinet maker, and his son even more so. If you fancy buying a table by John Maclean, I'm afraid you're looking at 5 figures, brethren. He's up with, Chippendale and Sheraton as a cabinet maker. But we know nothing about where he was born, where he was initiated, where he was exalted. We know nothing about that. I'd love to know. If anybody can find out, please tell me. But John Maclean was a key figure, the father and promoter, and I think he was the one that was involved in, for example, the design of the apron, the design of the jewel, the layout of the chapter. Perhaps surprisingly, the Grand Chapter waited 3 years before they started giving out warrants. The first warrants, there were 8 warrants given in 1769. A couple of them up in the north of England, as you know, at the Canna chapter in Cone, and along the road, the chapter of Nativity, and a chapter in Bristol, all chapters still working. Only 2 or 3 of them, in fact, have closed since 1769, but those 3 in Cone and in Burnley and down in Bristol are all working still. I'll now go through, brethren, the subheadings of my talk to give you some idea of the range that I cover in it. It's quite, as I said, quite a long talk, but I've split it up into all these, I think, 23 sections. It gives you some ideas. Quite a long paper. After the introduction, I give the original legend, so you can compare the original 4th century story with what is part of the ritual nowadays, recounted, as you know, by the principal sojourner. I talk about, obviously, the degree of Scots Master, worked in London and the provinces in the 1730s. I talk about Andrew Michael Ramsay and his discourse, his oration of 1736. Andrew Michael Ramsay was a Scot. He spent most of his life in France, but he came back to London in 1728, 29 and 30 to promote a book that he'd written. And in that time, he was made a Doctor of Civil Law at Oxford, he was made a Fellow of the Royal Society, and he was initiated into Freemasonry in the Horn Tavern Lodge, where all the most important Masons of the period were members. Now, when he wrote his discourse in 1730, he went back to France in the end of 1730, and he remained in France then for the rest of his life. But in 1736, when he wrote his oration, it is perfectly clear that he knew the Hiramic legend and he knew the Royal Arch legend. And yet we have no record of anything more than his initiation in the Horn Tavern. He clearly got that information from the members of the Horn Tavern Lodge, maybe in 1730s when he was in London, possibly when the lodge met in Paris in 1734 and again in 1735. There's no record that he attended the lodge then, but he may well have done because he was living in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which is quite close to where to the centre of Paris. But it's interesting what he says, and in fact, French sources are particularly useful between about, well, should we say 1730 and 1745, because the Freemasonry that was worked in France at that period was English Freemasonry just in the French language. And there are a lot of descriptions of lodges and things like that in French, which are quite useful because they are describing what the procedures were, what the ritual was like, and so on, in England at that time. From 1743-45 onwards, the French started creating their own degrees, and of course that ceases then to be relevant. But there are some quite interesting French sources of the very early period. I talk about the early Scots Masters Lodges, obviously, and the word chapter, the use of that word. I talk about the Écossais degrees in France, they're quite important. I talk about the change in the name from Scots Master to Royal Arch. And then I talk about the Royal Arch in Ireland, which is quite important in the 1740s and 50s. And then, very interesting, I think, I talk about Irish Royal Arch artifacts from this period. They're very interesting, brethren. And obviously they will be illustrated in the published version of the paper. And then, of course, I talk about a famous Irish Mason, Lawrence Dermot, who came over to London and was the very successful Grand Secretary of the Ancients. And his Book of Constitutions, published in 1756, and his promotion of the Royal Arch and his devotion to the Royal Arch. I talk about the Royal Arch in Scotland in the early days, and likewise in Virginia and the USA. I talk about the Canna Lodge, that's one of the first lodges of 1769, their tracing board and their aprons and their robes, because these are the earliest ones that are extant and they're very interesting. I talk about the Royal Arch worked in ancient and modern lodges. it's well known that the ancients worked the Royal Arch and indeed KT in their craft lodges. What is not so well known is the moderns did too. If you look at, for example, Lodge of Probity, number 61 in Halifax, or Britannia Lodge number 139 in Sheffield, you find that in the 1760s and 70s and 80s and even in the 90s, they were working the Royal Arch not in a chapter or a warranted chapter, but in their craft lodges as separate ceremonies. And in many senses, the creation of the Grand Chapter in 1766 by the moderns, and they did their creation then of the Grand Encampment in 1791 for KT, was a catching up exercise. Now, in spite of the Grand Chapter being created in 1766, quite a lot of the lodges, particularly in the north of England, didn't bother too much about it. So, Lodge of Probity, for example, didn't apply for a warrant for its Chapter of Sincerity until 1790. And Sheffield, a bit later, they waited, well, it's 30 years after the signing of the Charter of Compact that the Chapter of Loyalty was set up in Sheffield. But it doesn't mean that there was no Royal Arch going on, quite the reverse. They were just carrying on as they had always carried on, by working these degrees within their craft lodges, ancients and moderns. I talk about the separation of the Royal Arch from the craft, which is at the moment quite an interesting topic that's being discussed at the moment. It's quite a current topic. And I try to explain why I think the moderns did it. The ancients didn't, but the moderns did. And then, of course, I talk about John Maclean, the father and promoter, insofar as we know about it. I look at the first warranted chapters in England. I look at the early Royal Arch jewels. My paper on the jewel is, of course, the jewel we use now, and that's the modern jewel. The ancients had a completely different jewel, which had the arch on it, and maybe that's an indication that perhaps the layout of the chapter that changed in the 1760s for certain may very well have come from Ireland. And then lastly, I look at the famous word in 3 languages, which has been so much discussed and about which the most enormous amount of drivel has been written, frankly, over the last 200 years. It came from France. It entered the Royal Arch in England. It came from France probably through Pierre de Lintot in the 1770s. It certainly came from France. The earliest descriptions are in French. And it was used in the Royal Arch right up to, about 1985, and there was quite a fuss when it was dropped. But I can tell you that it was a French invention. It was not the original Royal Arch word, which is the one that we use now, and was simply, as I say, well, something made up that sort of crept into the order and was there for about 200 years. But luckily now, originally we have the proper original Mason word, which is what, of course, the candidate receives in the Royal Arch, which is why it is the second part of the 3rd degree. We get the genuine secret of a Master Mason, can I underline that, of a Master Mason in the Royal Arch. We don't get sort of Royal Arch secrets, we get the genuine secret, namely the Mason word is given to the candidate in the Royal Arch. Leaves the Master Mason degree with substituted secrets until such time as the genuine secrets are discovered. And that's where they're discovered. Where they're discovered? In the crypt and within the Royal Arch ceremony of the Supreme Order. So that's my paper, brethren. I'm delivering it, as I say, in London, in Great Queen Street, on the 20th of February 2025. I'm not going to read the paper out, brethren. It's far too long and wouldn't be appropriate. I shall introduce it, and then I'm going to leave lots of time for questions, which I shall try to answer, and I'm sure lots of people will have questions, and also for people to hopefully add information that I don't know. I'm sure it's going to be a very busy meeting. I'm sure it's going to be a very lively meeting, because the Royal Arch is a subject that most Masons are very interested in and have opinions about and so on. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope to see you there, brethren. Thank you for watching.